All right, welcome back to Visual Arts with Mr. Matson. Today we're going to be looking at graphite technique, specifically hatching and cross-hatching, and then how we use our pencils. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is our pencils. So your pencil is so important when you're working with graphite. We want a quality pencil. So your pencils that you're wanting to work with are drawing pencils. Drawing pencils usually come in a tin that looks like this. Drawing pencils are really, really important because you can get a big range of value. The biggest thing that I would like to impress upon you as a student is that I want you to avoid a mechanical pencil. Mechanical pencils have their place. They're great for sketching, they're great for writing, they're great for drafting, but they're not great for applying value. They're going to change what's called the tooth of the paper, and that's going to create a not great texture in your piece. It's going to bring it down in quality. So we want to use drawing pencils because they don't change the tooth of the paper, and they make it so you can get a really wide range of values. So speaking of range of values, each of your pencils in your pencil kit, when you open it up, is going to be labeled like the band down here at the bottom. So we have 4H all the way to 5B. So if you look at my drawing pencil here, I just pulled one random out. This one is a 5B. It's upside down. You can't read it. It is a 5B. Okay, so 5B is going to be towards that darker end of the spectrum. So when I'm looking at these pencils, I have what's called a degree of hardness. A degree of hardness is just how light or dark that pencil is going to write. So H's are my hardest pencil, and they're going to write the lightest. So an hard pencil is going to mean that the graphite is going to be hard to get off of the pencil. So it's going to want to stay on the pencil, which means it's not going to come off onto your paper. So it's going to be pretty light. And then the opposite of that is a B, which is a soft pencil. So that means that the graphite wants to come off of the pencil. It's going to go onto your paper very, very dark. The way I typically remember that is H stands for hard and B stands for bold. So H's are hard and light, B's are bold and soft. So that helps me determine between the two. And then I have my full scale in front of me, usually. Try to keep your pencils in order. That's going to help you when you're working, so that way you don't have to guess which one's which. Now some vocabulary words that I want to go over. Starting over here with value. So value is how light or dark something is. Value is a relative term. That means it can change from one instance to the next. So in this case, some value might appear very light in one piece, but very dark in another. The next term that I want to look at is hatching. Hatching is a value technique that involves making marks in one singular direction. You change the mark and the value by changing the proximity of the mark. So how close the lines are together changes how light or dark that is. And then I'm going to jump ahead a little bit over here and we'll go back. So next is cross-hatching. We'll talk about hatching and cross-hatching a lot here in a second, but cross-hatching is a value technique where you apply different directions of hatching on top of each other, and those layering of the hatching is going to create a darker value. Then after that, we have tooth. Tooth is just simply the surface texture of paper. It's every piece of paper that you have has a different kind of tooth. Some of them have a lot of tooth to it, so it's very, very textured, and some of them don't. So like printer paper doesn't have a lot of texture to it versus our drawing paper or our watercolor paper has a little bit more texture to it. And we want that tooth to stay as intact as possible. That's why we don't use mechanical pencils. And then lastly, proximity. So proximity is how close one thing is to another. We talked about that in hatching. So proximity is where that comes into play. Proximity of line is how close lines are to each other. So if I have a high proximity, my lines are closer together versus if I have a low proximity, my lines are further apart. Let's go ahead and take a look at an example of hatching and cross-hatching. So this is a piece right here that's a still life drawing done by somebody on the internet. So they went ahead and uploaded this for our teachers to use. So looking at this, I can see that I have this still life drawing, and I have a huge range of values here, and it looks very seamless, well blended. I don't have a lot that I have qualms about really as an art teacher. It looks very well done. And so when I stand far away, it looks almost photorealistic. Yeah, I can see lights, I can see darks, I don't see a lot of texture, everything's great. But when I zoom in, like I have right here, you can see that all of these values are applied with just layering, hatching, and cross-hatching. So I have up here really strong evidence of hatching. Down here, I have cross-hatching. So that's happening in actually all of the places on this. If you take a look dark, you can see that the darker areas have a lot of cross-hatching and the lighter areas have just some hatching. So now let's look at how we as students can create cross-hatching and hatching on our own work. Okay, this is going to be a quick demonstration on how to do proper cross-hatching and hatching technique. So I'm going to look at the proper application of graphite through this demo. When we were looking a little bit ago, we talked about the range of values that graphite has. So we have our hardest graphite, which is our H's. So my hardest is an H, and then my softest actually goes all the way down to a 9B. So my darkest value that I'm going to create is with this 9B. I don't really use this that often. It's not very helpful for me to build up value. It gets just about as dark as a 7B or a 6B does, so I usually try to stay with these guys. When I'm working with basic hatching and cross hatching, when I'm starting, I'm usually going to go in with a B, a 2B, or an HB. So I'm going to stay in that early B range when I'm working. So this is my HB pencil right here. I'm going to go ahead and move those off to the side. This is my HB pencil. This is what I'm going to be working with to start my hatching and cross hatching. So the first thing I'm going to go over is hatching. So hatching is when we move our pencil in one direction to create value. So you can see my pencil is moving only in this side to side direction to create that value, and I'm using a close proximity of line, so that way I don't see the texture that's left behind. The texture we want is minimal. We don't want a whole lot of big textural marks like this, unless we are intending to do that, because sometimes a drawing will call for it, that we want those big rough marks. But for the most part, when we're trying to create blends of value, things like that, we want to keep this close proximity of line. So when I'm doing this, you'll also notice that I'm picking up my pencil in between. It's kind of, if I slow it down a little bit, you can see I draw the mark, I pick it up, and I pull it to the other side. So that's helping me keep with the one direction of things. So rather than going back and forth in a zigzag pattern, because if I get too far away, I can see that pattern starts to emerge. That's again creating those marks that we don't want. So I'm keeping things nice and tight and using one direction of mark the whole time. That way I can keep a seamless texture and really control. Value with graphite is called cross hatching. So when I'm working with cross hatching, it's very similar to hatching. I'm going to take all of those kind of rules and principles that we just talked about with keeping our lines close together, not using too intense of a mark, not using a zigzag pattern. I'm going to take those, I'm going to apply them, and I'm just going to take hatching and overlap it one over the other. So I'm going to take hatching in one direction and then cross it to create more intense values. So cross hatching, again, I'm going to start with just basic hatching. So I'm pulling those lines in one direction, close proximity, nice and tight. To create cross hatching, I am going to change direction. So you can do that either by changing the angle of your pencil. You can see I got a little bit too far away, so I'm going to go back in and fix that proximity of mark to get rid of some of that texture. You can see that I'm creating darker values. I can also change, if I really like moving my hand one way or another, I can rotate my paper. So I can rotate my paper, and if I really like moving like this, I can really intensify that value that way. So cross hatching, there's no number of directions that you have to go or don't have to go. As long as it's over 2, you've got cross hatching. So 2 or more is cross hatching, regardless if it's 2, regardless if you do it 9 different directions. All of that is cross hatching. We use cross hatching really to show a big intense range of values. So when I'm cross hatching, if I have a standard value chart, so let's say I'm going to do a 5-step value chart, which we use a lot. So step 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So step 1, that's going to be the light of the paper. That's going to be the lightest value that I've got. So I'm just not going to touch that one at all. Step 2, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Step 2 here, that's going to be where I'm just going to do some basic hatching. So I'm going to keep my pencil light. I'm going to move in that single direction, trying to keep my value consistent throughout. You can note that I'm going into the other boxes. That's fine. I can fix that up with an eraser, or here in a second you'll see that this one will disappear when I cross hatch. And then 3 is going to be my mid-tone, so I'm going to use some cross hatching to get there. So I can pull those in, and I can change my direction. And now I have some mid-tones happening. And then I would continue that into 4 and 5. So 4, I would do 2 levels, I would probably add a third, and then 5, I would go all the way to the darkest level that I can get. So let's see how dark I can get just an HB pencil. Keep it just to the half to make it a little bit quicker. So you can see I'm pulling multiple directions. There's 2, I can go 3, and 4. And I can repeat directions as well. And you can see I can get pretty dark with just an HB pencil. So that would be my full range of value from 1 to 5 with an HB pencil. So you can see that I'm just using cross-hatching and I can get a lot of values going, especially if I start mixing in other pencils. So let's say if I wanted to use that 9B that I was talking about, I can really cross-hatch that. You can see already how dark it is, and I can get a very, very rich, intense dark value. It's not quite black, but it's really, really close. And so I can get that to happen. And you'll notice with the softer pencils, if I use the side of them, I don't really see a lot of marks. I get this kind of soft, almost charcoal-like texture, which helps because you don't have to worry about this as much, and it's beneficial. So I can really amp up those darks. So if I'm working with 3 or 4 pencils, I can get a wide range of values. So if I'm working with an HB and a 6B or a 9B, I can get a whole drawing done, and I don't really need to rely on everything else. So that's the beauty of cross-hatching, is that you don't get stuck with just one pencil or another. You can get them to blend into each other. You can create some more subtle values. You can create some gradients, which are really important. So a gradient is the next thing that I would look at. A gradient takes this 5-step value chart and just smooths it out. So if I were to take a gradient, I usually do my gradients a little smaller, just so you can see it. So this is gonna be the lightest, this is gonna be the darkest. I usually start at the darkest, because I know that if I put too much there, that's okay, because I'm going to keep building into that. So this is just my hatching. See, I'm pulling that into my light and going all the way to the dark. I can also change the pressure when I'm doing this, but I'm trying not to. Changing the pressure, if I put too much pressure on the paper, it's gonna change what's called the tooth of the paper. We talk about the tooth a lot with graphite drawings. The tooth of the paper is really important because it's what's holding the graphite to it, and it keeps the paper more luminous as you're working. So we want the tooth of the paper to remain intact. So to do that, we're gonna not apply a whole lot of pressure. We're just gonna keep things nice and light, because if I were to, let's say, really intensely apply that, if I were to flip this over, you can see it on the backside. I don't know if you can see it in the camera, but we can see it on the backside, and it also creates bumps, which we want to avoid. So I try not to use too much pressure, because that changes how the paper interacts and reacts with the other materials. So that is hatching and cross-hatching. I will talk more about that throughout the week.